Now, Zimbabwe is exploring innovative funding options to fund the education sector outside of the fiscus. This came out during a meeting between legislators, government, and civil society held in Harare today to discuss Zimbabwe's adaptation of the Tashkent Declaration on Transforming Early Childhood Development. Our reporter Sharon Munjenjema gives us more.
Zimbabwe's education system was once the envy of Africa, but standards have deteriorated mainly due to inadequate funding. Legislators are now pushing government to put more money into the sector, starting with early childhood development.
As a committee, we are completely seized with this matter of enhancing equal access to ECD education, as evidenced by the benchmarking visit undertaken early this year in February, Finland. The visit was indeed an eye-opener and provided a basis to call the government to action. It is our hope that once the report is tabled in Parliament, it will stimulate debate that in turn will strengthen ECD funding policy in Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe is a signatory to the 2022 Tashkent Declaration, stipulating governments ensure that at least 10% of their education budgets goes towards the early childhood development sector. Less than 1% of Zimbabwe's education budget is currently going to early childhood development. The Zimbabwean government is committed to changing this.
For infant school module, the infant school module covers ECDA to grade 2. However, we heard clearly that the allocation is very low, just about 10% for the whole ministry. So, as Zimbabwe, I think we also need to look at it and come up with innovations that funding models that favors the ECD.
Zimbabwe hopes to increase its early childhood development funding to 5% of the education budget. Legislators and civil society are pushing for alternative funding such as domestic resource mobilization.
There's need to consider what we call domestic financing, where we have got, apart from the public funding which goes through the Ministry of Finance, there is need for a fund just like the AIDS levy or a fund just like the IMTT, which you can use to directly go to education or early childhood development. But it has been done somewhere. It is in this, we are saying it should be looking at special projects such as for infrastructure development.
Domestic resource mobilization to fund education has worked in countries like Uzbekistan, where education is free for all. Sharon Munjenjema for ZTN News.
We are now joined on the line by education economist Pepukai Chikobore to discuss the story further. Good evening, Pepukai.
Good evening.
To get right into the meat of the issue, the Tashkent Declaration states that 10% of education budget should go toward childhood development, and that has not been the case with Zimbabwe. Where are the gaps, and how do you suggest these gaps are actually plugged?
Thank you for that question, and good evening to our viewers. You realize that Zimbabwe in 2023 allocated approximately 98.2 billion, which is equivalent to 16% of our budget to education. But of that, you realize that very few is going towards ECD. And of that ECD budget, which I can say is approximately 16% of the education budget, 93% of it is going towards the salaries for the educators, for the teachers. And we are leaving only 2% of the capital budget, only 1% for grants, and only 4% for goods and services. But the gaps in ECD related to infrastructure development, because most of our learners are learning under very deplorable conditions. And ECD is different from primary education in the sense that for ECD learners, they require special teaching and learning materials, including playground and play environment. And with a poultry allocation of 4%, we cannot then realize the right to education for our kids, because 93% is going towards teacher salaries. So that's where we are getting it wrong in terms of the allocations, although we allocated 16% to education, but the mix in terms of the allocation is wrong.
Now, there is talk of alternative funding outside the fiscus. What are some of the areas that authorities could actually explore to perhaps source more funding for our educational sector?
To answer that question, I can give examples from the region and beyond. Example, in Botswana, they have a plan where they are implementing and inculcating a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship and financing that from the resources, diamonds that they have. In Ghana, they set aside 2.5% of their VAT collections fund the Ghana Education Trust Fund. And in Nigeria, they have also done the same, but for Nigeria, it's for tertiary education. So Zimbabwe can earmark a certain percentage of, say, collections in VAT or mineral resource revenues for education. Or we can set a certain proportion of our this tax, 2% IMTT tax. We can ring-fence it to provide basic education, particularly targeting ECD. So that's an avenue that we can also pursue. Or we can also make sure that the resource rents or the revenues that we generate from our minerals and our vast and abundant resources are also ring-fenced to support ECD learners.
Well, finally, how does Zimbabwe fare in the SADC region in terms of early childhood education funding?
So in terms of early childhood education in the region, Zimbabwe is ahead of other countries like Zambia and probably Eswatini, but we are far behind other countries because there's a percentage of the total government expenditure in 2020-2021 fiscal year. You realize that Namibia was on top with 19.5, followed by Botswana with 18.8, then South Africa 8.4, but Zimbabwe allocated 13%. So this year we are at 15%. So we are still far below the region because the regional average is around 17-18%, while its education for all targets is 20%. So in terms of the region, we are not very close to the top, and we are not far behind, but we are somewhere in the medium. But we need to improve so that we reach the target of 20% education for all that we have also agreed, and we have our government, especially the president, has agreed to those allocations at international level.
Well, thank you, Pepukai, for joining us on News Plus.